Welcome to the 54th OpenChain webinar. This webinar is based on a talk previously given in our Automotive workgroup. This talk covered topics which were of immediate interest to many people out there, and therefore it has been extracted and placed into this individual webinar. One of the key takeaways is that not only is there a lot of knowledge to be shared and to be gained, but you can also get help from people if you need them. Russ Ealing from OSS Consultants, who provides this presentation, is also someone who's perfectly willing and happy to answer emails or pick up the phone and talk. We're very fortunate in open source that not everything is about a commercial product to market. This is a community endeavor, and community participants are here to help. Let's dive right in and start talking about the complexities of open source in automotive.
Hi, everyone. My name's Russ. I'm the founder of OSS Consultants. We're a business dedicated to helping organizations of all sizes manage their use of open source software. So we help organizations with everything from scanning and audit services to building an entire open source program. We're an official OpenChain partner, so we offer services for both OpenChain ISO 5230 for compliance, as well as the security assurance specification conformance. Before starting the company, I spent over 20 years in several engineering roles at General Motors. I had responsibility at that time for designing and implementing a successful global open source governance program at GM, which at the time, back in 2013, was among the first of its kind, was once regarded as among the most comprehensive open source programs in the auto industry. As the open source compliance officer, I built the OSPO that was responsible for reviewing software in every part used in every GM vehicle across the globe. So today, myself and the rest of the team at OSS Consultants, we offer our recognized industry-leading expertise to help companies of all sizes scan, audit, and report on their software, as well as helping them to create some of the most efficient and comprehensive open source program offices. So we'll talk a little bit, just an overview of some of the high-level open source challenges in the auto industry. Given our audience today, the material on these slides here, I'm going to assume that everyone has some familiarity with the basics of open source software, or OSS for short. So with the known complexities that we have in the auto supply chain, we know there's a number of challenges that are faced on a fairly regular basis. So the use of software in the vehicle has increased exponentially, as has the use of open source software in the vehicle. So there's still a gap in the supply chain and across the auto industry in general regarding awareness and education around use of open source, though there has been considerable improvements, especially over the last 18 to 24 months with the SBOM initiatives that have taken place. So it's not uncommon for one automaker to have a supply chain that spans 18,000 global businesses or more. Those global businesses then do businesses with other automakers, other automotive suppliers, and often with other non-automotive customers. So how can the automotive industry achieve compliance and awareness around use of open source without adding more burdens to suppliers that are already in this intricate supply chain? So I had an interesting, perhaps single view of this when I was at GM, and my thought was, if we were going to lead in this space and drive open source compliance into the supply chain, it was important to get everyone in our supply chain on board. So how better to do that, at least at that time, than to make it a requirement to disclose use of open source when providing software to GM. So Now, as a consultant that not only helps automotive, but also non-automotive, I have a different view, or perhaps multiple views is the better term. If each automaker had their own set of requirements for open source, imagine what that variation does to a supplier in the supply chain that does business with multiple automakers or with other device manufacturers. Think of how many possible open source bill of material formats, or SBOM, software bill of material formats, or other compliance formats that you'd need to follow. So purely from my observations, it gets increasingly more difficult the further down the supply chain you go. As you have different variants of these requirements from each of your customers. So you're adding additional or more complexity to an already complex scenario. So this is an area that OpenChain can help to bring some consistencies to the approach, and can also help with reducing complexities in this space. But generally, it requires broad adoption by industry for it to be effective. So if you're new to OpenChain, or just joining as a first-time attendee to this session, I'd encourage you to have a look at the resources, the OpenChain resources. You can always reach out to me to help for any help. I'm happy to help clarify anything, or to be of any assistance along your open source journey. So this is a typical, very high level and very oversimplified model of a hypothetical supply chain for a single ECU. And ECU in this case stands for Electronic Control Unit. These are the embedded devices that are responsible for most functions in a vehicle, such as controlling your engine or transmission, your heating and cooling, navigation, infotainment, instrument clusters, anti-lock braking, etc. So that single ECU may be used across a particular model line, but not necessarily be used in a different model line. So for example, vehicle A might have model variants 1, 2, and 3. Some or all of those models could then use that one ECU, but vehicle B, which may have its own variants, may not use that same ECU that was used in vehicle A. So you can imagine the complexity with that level of permutations across a vehicle portfolio. So most automakers usually don't directly deal with the vendors beyond the tier 1. But typically the tier 3 would provide a small piece of hardware or a low-level software. The tier 2 supplier might provide a component like a processor, or sometimes an operating system or an application. And then the tier 1 typically provides a finished ECU to the OEM. The OEM then uses that ECU in a vehicle, and then performs the vehicle assembly, and of course the ultimate sale to the customer. So the average vehicle has generally greater than 30 ECUs, and then depending on content, the combination of ECUs could also be different. So we have a number of challenges. How do we know if everyone in the supply chain has declared all open source used, or all of their included dependencies? Perhaps declaring top level or package level or direct dependencies, the licenses for those, maybe that's sufficient at some companies. Some software companies still declare they aren't using any open source, but then their story generally changes once we're able to scan their software for use of open source, and discover, to everyone's surprise, that they are in fact using plenty of open source, just like the rest of the modern world. Here's another challenge. It's not common, or at least it wasn't common, to get source code from suppliers in the auto industry. So there's generally not a robust way to verify, at least at a granular level, what's actually being provided beyond asking for the information in your own proprietary format, of course. Just kidding. According to a 2020 report that I saw, a developer has had access to almost 22,000 new open source component releases per day since the beginning of 2018. So it's easy to see that the pace of software development has surpassed our capacity for being able to manually identify licensing and security concerns at a granular level, or a level that's granular enough to mitigate the risk. Again, that report was from 3 years ago, and I suspect that number has grown significantly beyond the 22,000 today. Actually, there was a report from OSI earlier this year that said 80% of survey respondents had an increase or a significant increase in their use of open source in their applications. And less than 20% of survey respondents said their use of open source stayed the same or decreased. So while it seems conceivable that everyone in a distributed supply chain could, or at least should, be able to provide open source usage information, rarely, if ever, does it ever come out as clean as this to the automaker. So, I mean, ideally, you would have the open source usage report from the supply chain, as well as the open source usage from the OEM that makes up that one single comprehensive bill of materials for a particular device or ECU. Is there anyone here from the automotive industry in here that has been able to comprehensively achieve this yet? And we can chat about that after if you'd like. So historically, a comprehensive open source bill of materials would have been extremely rare. I'd say it's better today, especially due to the recent SBOM efforts over the last couple of years. But I think we still have a long way to go around awareness and adoption of open source best practices, such as those identified in OpenChain. Another point on this slide before I move on, if everyone agrees that an open source bill of materials or software bill of materials for this single automotive ECU might be challenging, how about an open source bill of materials or software bill of materials for an entire vehicle? So I think we've got some work to do. Another challenge is your own internal engineering and development centers around the globe that use different software development lifecycle processes and tools, depending on what kind of software they're using. So an infotainment and navigation system requires a significantly different development process and configuration management than, say, an engine controller does. To have an efficient process for managing open source means the OSPO or other governance structure has to have a consistent policy for managing that use, regardless of how or where that software is developed. Another important distinction in this diagram, it's not just the difference in the types of devices, but how they're connected. So open source is likely used in all of these devices to some degree. Device A has a display, so it could use that potentially for displaying any required license compliance material. It's also on the same communication bus as device B and device C. Device D doesn't have its own display, and it's not directly connected to a display in the vehicle. In fact, it's on a completely separate communication bus, maybe like a LIN bus, and it comes from a completely different supplier and plays an entirely different function in the vehicle. So where should device D have its required license material, that's compliance material? Some people might say it belongs in the owner's manual. Others might say it should be hard-coded into the main vehicle display. But then how would those locations be updated if device D gets a service replacement with a change in software, or has its software updated by an over-the-air update? Obviously, we can't get too deep into this today, but the good news is that it can be managed with the right approach, the right tools and processes in place. Again, feel free to reach out if you want to discuss this point further. So what can we learn from the complexity of managing open source in a distributed supply chain like the automotive supply chain? So as a global organization, it was important for me to have a simplified open source governance structure and process that could be applied to any of GM's global engineering development centers. Sometimes this structure or team is referred to as the OSPO, or Open Source Program Office. I spoke of inventory relative to an open source bill of materials, and we don't have time to cover it here, but equally important is the inventory of all of your open source usage, but especially in your distributed products. So absolutely, it takes effort and time to set up, but it's worth it if you consider the potential consequences. I really like to take this back to basics a bit, because the thought of meeting some of the recent SBOM requirements is daunting for a lot of people. But inventory is critical regardless of your focus, whether that's SBOM or software bill of materials, open source compliance, or the security of open source software. If you've heard any of my other talks before, you can't comply, secure, or remediate any software you don't know is there. I say that in almost every talk I give. So don't not do SBOM or software bill of materials because it's big. You have to start with the basics if you need to. And by all means, please reach out if you'd like to chat about this further, or you need help getting started. But it's important that everyone starts somewhere, because inventory of your open source can yield large dividends. This is where the inventory and tracking practices in the automotive industry apply really well. So every car built has a listing of every part required to build that car. This helps automakers to quickly track and then address any quality issues. If and when a part happens to be faulty, they're able to quickly determine which cars were affected, and then prioritize any subsequent actions that might be needed, such as recalls or service bulletins. The same is true, or should be true, for software. Similar to automotive parts, with an inventory, a company can track every open source component they use and have better ability to resolve any issues if and when they arise. In the case of security, which we didn't touch on too much here, knowing the exact version of each component is critical. And an accuracy of an open source bill of materials allows your organization to quickly assess these risks and potentially reduce or eliminate any unnecessary rework. Collaboration is really important, both inside your organization and outside. I often talk with others in the software or open source space to understand their best practices as well as any pain points. And I also try to share some of my experience with what works and sometimes what may not have worked so well. But honestly, I'm a big fan of people just asking if they have a question. Anyone can reach out anytime if you've got a question. I'm happy to share experiences, best practices. I'm a consultant in this space, so myself and the team, we see a really broad range of what works in industry and what doesn't work, from organizations of all sizes all around the world. So I promise you're not bothering me, and I'm more than happy to help. Reach out by email, or feel free to find me on LinkedIn, which should be pretty easy as well. So some of the keys to managing open source risk: when you have an implemented compliance program or OSPO in your organization, you get better understanding and traction within your organization. Inventory of your open source is, excuse me, critical. You need to know what you're using and how you've complied. This can also help with assessing your risk, as we discussed earlier, but it'll also help you to formulate any longer-term strategies for risk mitigation. So you want to require your third-party suppliers and OEMs to disclose their use of open source to you. You don't know what your risk is until you know what you've used in your product. As I said earlier, you can't remediate or fix what you don't know is there. Discovering issues earlier in the development cycle means or can mean less impact on development times and meeting business deadlines. You can think of finding licensing issues or security issues to finding a bug in a software application. The earlier it's discovered, the less expensive and the less of an impact it is to correct. And then, as you'll see in the OpenChain reference material, the basics of open source compliance and management of open source should be taught at all levels in the organization. Continuing on with some additional keys to managing risk. So from a strategy perspective, to be successful and efficient, you need a strategy for execution, and perhaps most importantly, someone to lead that effort. You should have a vision and defined goals that cover what you want open source usage and compliance to look like in your organization. Some considerations here are lining up your vision and goals with the strategy of the organization itself. What's the best or most efficient model for managing compliance at your organization? It might be a distributed team. It could be functional responsibility. It could be a centralized approach. There isn't always necessarily a one-size-fits-all or cookie-cutter approach to this. Team structure and other resourcing to support that model might be another consideration. Policy should be designed with the company's culture and the strategy in mind. The policy should be a statement of your expectations regarding use of open source, and that should be communicated or at least available to most parts of the organization that might be involved with software development. Having a well-defined policy in place is certainly important, but it's got to be a well-defined minimal policy. Otherwise, you'll have lawyers, security folks, business folks, all piling in their concerns and constraints. And then soon you'll end up with a straitjacket full of policy that basically means nobody can do anything. Another common, but in my opinion, sometimes ineffective form of open source policy is the concept of a whitelist or a blacklist. Licensing in open source is very contextual. So the scenario that surrounds each use case matters because it can change the risk profile. The other reason this type of list doesn't work well most often is that brand new licenses are added to software projects, potentially every single day. So it'd be impossible to maintain which licenses are allowed and which ones are not allowed. The last thing I'll say about this kind of list is that most software developers, while they're developing, are not going to look at it every time they want to potentially use a piece of software, which is why the process is so important. So with process, we want to develop we've talked about the formal open source strategy and the policy, and now we're talking about process here. So you want to empower your organization to balance the business benefits with the right amount of risk management. So without a good process for use of open source, you don't have any rules or control over what's actually getting used, and then what to do when it doesn't align with what your organization allows. I find too often managing use of open source is spread across several people, and perhaps each of them responsible for a particular functional area, such as legal or security. The problem with this is that it lacks ownership and accountability. Further, I think most processes aren't defined in a single place, and they require developers to just know how things are supposed to work. It's a broad assumption. So the processes that we help create, they're very efficient, and they're designed to meet the goals of the business. So not just legal, not just security, but most importantly, developers and engineering staff. So the process for whatever you're putting together can be designed for an entire dedicated team or even a team of one. So it's important to still be creative while being effective. For developer training, here again, the focus should be on efficiency and key developer takeaways. I've seen and heard of open source training sessions that take several hours to several days. These generally aren't as productive, or they don't yield much practical fruit. We can't, or at least shouldn't, expect to turn a developer into an open source license expert. I generally want to make it easy for a developer to do the right thing and difficult to do the wrong thing. So the developer training sessions that we do are generally under an hour, but they highlight only the 3 or 4 things that I want them to do really well, and then let the process manage the rest. Creating an OSPO or other type of governance structure, this would be the designated place that acts as your center of competency for an organization's open source operations and their structure. So sometimes this includes setting code use, code distribution, selection of software, auditing, and potentially other policies. As well as training and ensuring legal compliance, and then promoting and building community engagement, which can also help benefit the organization strategically. There's a growing number of companies adopting open source program offices to be their centers of competency. There was a GitHub survey from earlier this year that showed over 30% of Fortune 100 companies have now implemented an OSPO to help structure their organizational policies and procedures around use of open source. And GitHub, the folks that put out that report, like us, they expect the number to increase going forward. So an OSPO doesn't need to be a massive investment from a resource perspective. You could certainly have an OSPO of 1 if that works for your organization. An OSPO of 1 might also be just a great starting point for you. So some of the benefits of having an open source governance program. When you have an open source governance program like an OSPO, you get better understanding of use of open source within the company, better confidence in your open source compliance posture. Your formal processes will help your developers to make informed decisions about the risks surrounding use of open source. And as a result, the company's exposure to the risks around open source usage would be significantly reduced. In addition to all of these, implementing an open source governance program directly helps you just become a better software company. And every company's at a different stage of maturity with this. But some specific actions could be to get support from your leadership on making this more important, or how to make this more important to them. How do you make it more robust? You might want to engage your legal staff to help build your case for why this is important. See what you can do from an automation perspective. Leverage the policy management features of your scanning tools if you happen to use those. And I think I better stop there. That's all the slides I have. I want to leave enough time for all the other presenters, but as I mentioned throughout the slides, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions on any of the topics that we discussed here. Always happy to help, but especially if you happen to be stuck on how to get started with any of this.